Great. Thank you all for coming out tonight to our event with Denver UX. We are going to be learning all about behavioral design using the COM-B model of behavior change in UX with Amy Bucher tonight. And hold on, there we go. So this is our board of directors, I guess, or organizers for Denver UX. We are starting to have some live events again. We just had a happy hour last week. Got to see a lot of you out there for that. So stay tuned for some more happy hours monthly. And then also a live event coming up in September for Denver UX. We don't really have a lot of information about that, but it's going to be awesome. So stay tuned. Oops. Okay. And then for Denver UX newbies, we have Joe Natoli coming to do an Ask Me Anything. And Joe is awesome. He has a learning platform that I am a part of, and I've learned a lot about freelance and just all things UX from him. Just a really great speaker, consultant, and author as well. So come out in August for that. And then tonight we have Amy Bucher here. She is VP of Behavioral Change at Lirio and author of this really amazing book, Engaged. You can see it right here. It's one of my favorites. So if you like what you learned tonight, I definitely recommend this book on Amazon. And that's all. I'm going to let Amy kind of talk a little bit more about her background if she'd like, and I'll hand that over. Oh, also wanted to mention we're going to be taking questions in the chat. So feel free to put any questions throughout the evening in the chat. And stop share. So Amy, if you want to share your screen, you're more than welcome to do so.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out virtually to talk with me tonight. Really excited to be here. We've been talking about this for a few months now, but as some of you may have realized, I recently changed jobs. So in the transition, I wasn't able to do this until now, and I'm just really excited that the day is finally here. So let me share my slides. I do also have some browser-based resources that I'll be sharing at a future point in the discussion tonight. So I'll give you a little bit background on me, but I also want to say up front that I hope this is a conversational session as much as it can be in virtual. So please do use the chat. I'll try the best I can to look at it myself. It's a little hard when you're presenting with the way that Zoom arranges the windows, but I will try to take a look at it, especially as I'm transitioning. And I really hope that, if you have questions along the way, make those known. I have told Ryan and Lene that if there are questions that are kind of clarification type things, I'm really happy to stop along the way and make sure that people know what I'm talking about. I'd much rather do that than give this rehearsed talk and not have people understand a word I'm saying. So I hope that it can be kind of a friendly conversational learning sort of session. So just a little bit of background on me, Amy Bucher. I just joined Lirio a little over 2 months ago as the VP of Behavioral Design. My career has really been focused in this field of behavioral design, although it's only in the last few years that it's, I think, had the name and been called out as a distinct subset of design. I earned my PhD in psychology at the University of Michigan in 2006 and immediately jumped into industry, which is kind of an atypical career path. My first job happened to be in a healthcare company doing research. I fell in love with healthcare and the potential for behavior change in that area. And ever since, I've been part of organizations that really focus on healthcare as part of what they seek to help people with. So I've been a part of a startup that was acquired by Johnson & Johnson. I spent many years at Johnson & Johnson as kind of an internal behavior change consultant and expert. I spent some time at CVS Health working on strategy in the digital pharmacy space. And then I spent 5 years at MadPow in their behavior change design function as a consultant. So again, working with external clients on all manner of projects and fun challenges. So kind of a varied career, but healthcare and behavior have been the two threads. So game plan for tonight. We have a mural board for activities. I'm going to throw that in the chat right now. And I'm not running, this is not a workshop, because we didn't know how many people would be here and it's kind of difficult to do that, but we do have some activities. I would like this to really, as I said, be a learning session. And then I'm going to ask either Ryan or Lene to put into the chat the link to the Google Doc. So I also have a spreadsheet that I put together, and I copy it all the time and provide it to people, but it's kind of my like working space for all of this COM-B stuff. So I made a copy to make available to all of you. It's a read-only copy, but you should be able to copy it to your own Google space. And then you'll have sort of a resource that you can use if you want to try to do COM-B on your own. So with that, there it is, it's in the chat. So I did want to start by just getting a sense of who's here today. And you already did some of this, you were sharing where you're all from, but I would be really interested, and you can either put it, I said put in the mural board. Let's use the mural board. If you wouldn't mind putting in the mural board, just put a post-it with a little bit about your role in your industry. And the reason I'm interested in that is because I can tailor the examples I use as I talk a little bit to the types of backgrounds that you have. I know my history is really healthcare focused, but not everybody's is. So trying to make sure I'm being as relevant as I can for everybody. So I'm going to switch to sharing the mural board for a second here. All right. All right, I'm seeing med tech. Got near robotic process automation. That's cool. Boot camp student, just grad. Oh, nice. A lot of people new to the field. Media psychology, awesome. Product designer with some healthcare clients.
I got a question about Mural. I've used Miro, but where are the sticky notes in here?
So you can either double click in the white space, or over on the side, if you can see my screen here, this little icon, the square up in the upper left. That's right, I should use my directional words. I find that Miro and Mural are very similar, but it's almost confusing how similar they are because the differences are easy to get tripped up on. All right, we've got finance, civic tech, really cool, childcare,
Where is this board?
Here, I'll put it in the chat again.
Yeah, I'm an engineer, mostly electrical, but multidiscipline, and I'm trying to learn this stuff for a platform that I'm working on.
Okay. I'm also I should be sharing my screen. Am I successfully sharing my screen?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so it looks like there's a good variety of people here. I'm thankful that I worked for MadPow for many years and have lots of different examples that I can draw from. I'm going to switch back to sharing my slides. All right. Okay. So what is all this about? To change what people do, we have to understand why they do it. And that's something that my training in psychology has really prepared me to think about. When we know what makes people tick, we can design interventions that engage them. And you will hear me use the word intervention. It's sort of jargon, but it's just the terminology we use in behavioral design to mean anything that we're creating that is intended to change people's behavior. It can be an app, it can be a conversation, it can be a communication. The thing is, it's designed and intended to change behavior. The COM-B model, which I'm going to talk about tonight, helps us to identify specific barriers and facilitators to the behaviors we want to promote. So we're really starting with that goal. What is it we would like our users, and I will use that generic term users just for ease here, but of course it might look like patients or customers or collaborators even. It could be a partner, but it helps us to identify what we would like our users to do. And when we get really specific about that and we apply these behavior change frameworks to that behavior, we're able to start to get specific about what are the levers that we have available to us to design for. So just to start, I saw many of you have backgrounds in psychology. I'm sure that even some of you who didn't put on the board that you do also do. A lot of people have taken psychology courses or UX boot camps that draw on psychology. And so you're probably aware that there are a number of different psychology frameworks used in design. I actually did some work for a client several years ago where they asked me to do an inventory of some of the more popular frameworks. And I came up with a list of 50 or 60 of them, only really did a deep dive into a dozen. But the fact is there are a lot out there. And so I did want to start by saying, why is COM-B one that has a prominent place on my shelf, one that I use frequently in my projects, really in every job I've had since the framework came to be about 10 years ago. So a couple of reasons. The COM-B model of behavior change, first of all, is straightforward. You'll see that, I can probably explain the whole thing in 10 minutes if I'm trying to fly through. So it's not overly complex. You don't need behavior change expertise to understand it. And that's really important to me in my design role because most of the people that I collaborate with do not have a behavior science or behavior change expertise. They're coming from other disciplines, other backgrounds, and we're working together collaboratively. So I need to be able to have a language I can speak with them that's accurate from the science perspective, but also makes sense to them. COM-B offers me that. The second is that it's really structured, as you'll see. And even, I know you can all see the mural board in your browsers now, so you can even see how you can step through it. It's very clear and easy to follow. That structure means it lends itself really well to projects. And again, it's easy to communicate to people. It's evidence-based. I should probably put this at the top of the list, but I know that most people don't get as excited about this as I do. This is a big part of my role in general, is making sure that the approaches we take have a root in research, that there is evidence out there that shows that this is an approach that is likely to be effective for the outcomes we are trying to achieve. COM-B has that. And then it's collaborative. It plays nicely with other disciplines. So I mentioned I'm always working on cross-disciplinary teams. And it's difficult with some sorts of approaches and frameworks when you come in and you say, this is the way we're going to do it. And it makes other people's work more difficult or adds a lot of tasks to the workflow and extends timelines. I've had that happen before. COM-B is really easy to slot in with the activities that are likely to be part of a design project already. And I'll show you a little bit around the research side. That's where my role often gets involved. But even later in the process, COM-B plays very, very nicely with other sorts of tasks and approaches. So these are all reasons why I tend to use it often. This is the basic process of building a behavior science intervention. I really like the imagery of the nesting dolls here, but you start with the smallest bit, which is defining the target behaviors. You really need to think about what is it that I want my users to do. And you have to do that with some degree of specificity. This is typically something that ends up getting negotiated in my experience between a client and, well, I'm coming out of many years of consulting. I'm in-house again now. So now it's not necessarily a client. It might be a product manager or someone like that. But there's typically someone who comes to the table and says, this is what our users need to do. They have an idea of what has to happen for a product to be successful. And then there's typically some negotiation around that, which is not to say that they don't have the right answer to begin with, but you want to pressure test that. You want to make sure, if we're looking at the product success metrics, is this really the behavior that people need to do to get us there? So that's a very early task in all behavioral design projects, and I think a really fun one. Once you have identified those target behaviors, this is now where COM-B comes in. So the B in COM-B is for behavior. It's an acronym. It stands for capability, opportunity, motivation, behavior. The B is really the center of the whole structure. So we have to have that defined first. And once we have it, we can do the analysis of the other pieces. That COM-B analysis will help us understand what's making that behavior harder or easier for people to do. And once we have that, we can start to figure out, okay, how do we design to fix it? How do we design to make this behavior as easy, as likely as possible? So that's, and I'm giving you the jargon here because I want to express the framework in its accurate way, but this identify intervention functions is really, what is the product going to do? Like, what is the function of the product with respect to the things that make this behavior harder to do for people? And then lastly, once you've figured out that function, like what are we going to offer, you get into the very detailed design. And that's where you determine the design features. And I'll show you, it's also adding BCTs, behavior change techniques. I'm going to pause here just for a second and give you a little bit of background on COM-B and the behavior change wheel, which is the larger organization it's part of, because I mentioned that it's evidence-based. And one of the things that's really cool about it is that it's based off of a taxonomy. So the research hub for this is University College of London in London, England. And about 10 years ago, the research team started to do a comprehensive review of research studies that had been put out there about changing people's behavior. And they wanted to create a taxonomy. What is the universe of behavior change techniques that exist? What is the universe of barriers that exist? And as they went through this process, they discovered there are a limited number of barriers, the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation that are part of COM-B. So pretty much anything that you read in a published research study, you can file as one of those three. There are, of course, cases where it's a little bit more difficult, but in general, it's a really good universal set of categorizations. And then similarly, there was a universal set of what they called intervention functions. There's 10 of them. And that's just like kind of a category of thing. You'll see one of them is education, for example. And then lastly, there was a pretty discrete set of behavior change techniques. And so now we basically have this manual that tells us, here are the things that might be going wrong for somebody. Here are the ways that we might be able to fix it. And depending on which way you choose to address a problem, here's the specific flavors in which you might design around it. So it's this very nice structure, but again, it all goes back to that research. So there's evidence behind all of these items. So I was hoping to do a little bit of chat here, and this is something I did when I started writing my book. So I had this vision at first that I was going to include all these surveys and really collect data from people about how they had experienced behavioral design and what types of interventions they used in their life. And I discovered something interesting, and so I want to try to recreate it a little bit here. I'd be really curious to see in the chat, when I'm talking about behavioral interventions, what's coming to mind? And I put apps or programs, but it really, as I said, intervention is kind of a generic term for anything that's intended to change people's behaviors. And I'd be really interested to hear, maybe what's on your mind. Oh, a lot of Noom, wow. Yeah, My Sugar, Wise, Google Maps, Wearables, Fitbit, Fabulous. Headspace, TED Talks, anything by Don Norman, social norm and social comparison interventions, mindfulness apps, Duolingo, quit smoking, FOGS, behavioral model, habit tracking, Whoop, app that counts number of steps in a day, social media. Cool, this is a really good set. It's hard to think of this without pathologizing the user. Tobacco cessation, weight loss, laws and legal mandates. Yeah, these are great. And I'll tell you what I noticed when I asked is that there were oftentimes, and I've seen it a little bit in this group of suggestions as well, things that came up that are not in and of themselves interventions. So they're tools that could be used as part of an intervention, but they don't really have a specific behavior change purpose embedded in them. So YouTube is a great example of that. Facebook is one that came up a lot in my initial research, where you could do something on that platform that's intended to change behavior, but the platform in and of itself is, it's more of a content delivery mechanism. But yeah, you all seem to have a good handle. And I'm going to save the chat at the end of this because I love your list. All right, so the first part, as I mentioned, is defining target behaviors. And one of the things that I've been asked a lot is why behaviors, why not thoughts or feelings? And especially because, as we'll talk about in a moment, oftentimes there are thoughts or feelings that are really worthy targets of a design. In psychology, we think about outcomes as being the product of a behavior one way or another. So we know that what people feel can affect what they do, what they think obviously affects what they do and what they feel. All of these things are related. But ultimately, when we're looking at like a product environment, when we want to say we want to reduce costs around healthcare or we want to increase savings around retirement, those sorts of things boil down to behaviors. So we may absolutely design in order to change somebody's feelings or to have them think differently about a behavior. But if it doesn't ultimately show up in their behavior, we won't be successful in achieving the outcomes that we're targeting. And you'll actually see in COM-B, some of the intervention functions are really geared towards feelings or the way that people think. But again, it's always with an aim to how do we ultimately make that behavior more likely? So what is a behavior? A behavior is something that people do. Usually you can observe it. And and the behaviors that you want to change with your product are referred to as target behaviors. So I will say here, when I was writing my book as well, one of the exercises that you go through is you have a technical or a set of technical reviewers, a group of people who have expertise in your topic, who are reading your book to make sure that it's accurate and complete, and provide all sorts of great feedback along those lines. And so I had one of my former colleagues, who is also a PhD psychologist working in behavioral design, serve as a technical reader, and he had a long conversation with me about this. A behavior is something people do. Usually it can be observed, because there are cases where behaviors are not observable, and biofeedback is a great example of that. I decided, for purposes of the book, I wanted to keep it simple and not overly complicated. I also had an editor who was thinking about things from a different perspective and was like, you are not writing a 2-page call out about non-observable behaviors. But just because this audience seems like you're pretty savvy around these topics, I just wanted to call out that, yes, there are some behaviors that are not going to neatly fit this definition, and I made a deliberate decision to couch it this way. So which ones are behaviors? This is a list of things that I have actually seen targeted in interventions, but I'll just quickly run through, and you can guess some of these are not behaviors. So maybe you just want to pop in the chat ones that you think are not. Walking in the park, feeling confident, taking a pill, losing weight, wanting to make a change, being happy, reading a chapter a night, saving $100 a month, preparing for retirement, practicing Spanish vocabulary. Yeah, and you guys are right on it. Losing weight is not a behavior. That's absolutely right. Not feeling confident, happy. This is the way that it shakes out. So the behaviors here you can see are pretty concrete. They're generally things that you could observe or measure without self-report, really. Did somebody walk in the park? Is the pill in their pill bottle, or did they take it? Are they practicing the Spanish behavior? Feeling confident, wanting to make a change, being happy, those are all mental states. Losing weight is an outcome. And then I put preparing for retirement in red, just because it is not specific enough at this point to be a behavior. We'd want to break that down even further into something that was more observable. So this saving $100 a month might be a sub goal for preparing for retirement, a behavior that ladders into that, but in and of itself. A question here, wouldn't losing weight be observable? Absolutely, but it's an outcome, not a behavior. The behaviors that lead to losing weight are things like eating differently or moving your body differently. It's running the calorie deficit. Are behaviors habits? Not necessarily. Behaviors can be episodic. Habits are typically repeated, but a behavior might be something like making a doctor's appointment, which wouldn't be a habit for most people, I hope. Selecting target behaviors. So the process of doing this typically starts off, like I said, oftentimes in the real world, what happens is somebody comes to you, a client or a product manager, or somebody in a position of ownership over the product, and says, hey, this is what we want our users to do. That's kind of the real world scenario. If you were starting from a blank slate, you would want to basically brainstorm the full list of behaviors that are related to the product goals. So if you know that you want to reduce, and this is coming from healthcare, this comes up a lot, reducing hospital readmissions after somebody's been a patient. So there are payments that are tied to keeping somebody out of the hospital after they've been discharged. You want to make sure that they're on the road to recovery, that they're not relapsing or having accidents or anything like that. And so a lot of healthcare systems will invest a lot of money in making sure that they don't have people coming back to the hospital. So that would be your kind of big goal. And then you'd want to brainstorm the behaviors that might lead you to achieve that goal. Once you have that list, though, you'd need to narrow it down. And I know some of you work in product management. I mean, you can't do everything in a product or in a release. And so you're going to want to start to think about what behaviors are the most tied to that goal. So if you only could do one or two things, which ones are going to get you the biggest lift? One of the things that I'm doing a lot in my role right now is I'm actually going back to the literature to see which types of behavior change techniques have the biggest effects on the outcomes that we're trying to drive. So, really, what is the evidence that this thing is going to produce the results that I need? And let's prioritize the ones that have the biggest impact on that. The others are more practical. Do you have access to the people who do that behavior? Sometimes your user group doesn't include the people who have the power over a particular outcome. So with hospital readmissions, I've worked in all different parts of the healthcare ecosystem. And I've worked on, for example, products that really just target patients and caregivers, and there's no physician component. Like we just do not have physicians or providers among our audience. And so if there's some sort of behavior that might lead to lower readmissions, but it's a physician behavior, that doesn't make sense for our product, even though it's a really good choice and kind of a universe without constraints. And then speaking of constraints, can you influence them within the constraints of your toolkit? What is your product? So if you have a mobile app, you're probably not going to do something that requires, I don't know, a lot of intricate filling in a form and doesn't lend itself to a mobile screen. You know, I work with a certain type of data now where we can't just do whatever we want. We need to be able to measure outcomes in a particular way. So really thinking about the practical limitations that your product presents. And the way that I often end up doing this is really just creating a score sheet. So this is a screenshot of a score sheet that it's from my MadPow days, but there's a version of this in my book as well, and really listing out the potential target behaviors and scoring them. And it doesn't matter what the score is. I have 0 to 3 here just because I don't like to do a lot of math, and that keeps the calculation pretty simple. But as long as you're doing something that provides you with a way to tell which ones of these behaviors might be more important to include as the design target for my product, then that's what you need. So this is very much like a progress over perfection type of exercise, but it's a way to help narrow down the universe of behavioral targets for your product. So with that, I thought it might be fun to go into the mural board and do a little bit of ideation around target behaviors. And ideally have people even come off mute and talk a little bit about what's easy and hard. So just maybe 5 minutes, and I'll put my screen on. Hold on, I've got to stop that. And I've got to do a new share of this. So on the mural board, here we go, behaviors. And I'm gonna summon people to me. All right. So everyone now who's in the mural board should be in the spot about target behaviors. And just take a minute, add a post-it with the behavior that you might target for your users in either your real professional role, or you can just pretend you're the designer for a favorite app or program that you use. And then we can chat about it a little bit. Oh. Ooh, these are so interesting. Getting people to pick up after their dogs in a conservation area. You should come to my neighborhood. That's a big problem where I live. Cook more at home, eating double portions by meals, standing during the day, using CPAP therapy, attend a virtual live class. Stop looking at emails. That's an interesting one because it's a negative behavior, right? It's stopping doing something. Ordering the correct products. Seeing how much insulin I'll be taking for my meal. That's a complicated one too. Engage users in their journey of owning a home. Is there anybody who's willing to talk a little bit about the behavior they selected and why?
I would if no one else wants to, but I've noticed that engineers, they usually want to consult individually. They don't want to usually work together. And if they work together, it would be a lot better.
I see a hand raised, but I can't see the person's name. You have a lovely headshot with glasses and a beard.
It's Carl.
Hi, your name wasn't showing up over your picture.
Oh, that's weird. Yeah, I picked getting customers to order products correctly. I work for a company that makes seat covers for cars, and our website doesn't make it easy to do that. So how can we make it easier? And then we custom produce everything for our customers, so they'll get this thing 3, 4, 10, 9 weeks later, and it's not right. So now they're angry. They have to ship it back. We've wasted all kinds of time and money and resources. So what can we do? Yeah. So, yeah.
All right, and Emily, and then we can move on. Thank you to the people with the hands raised. I appreciate it.
Oh, hi everyone. Is that Emily, me? There might be other Emilys.
Emily Rosenwig.
Yeah, that's me. I work at a healthcare system. We're working on a fall prevention program for seniors. And there's a whole series of behaviors around home safety. So like replacing rugs, getting them to put rug tape, getting them to buy night lights, getting them to put non-stick tape in the tub, getting them to move the furniture further away from the sofa. So a whole bunch of those kinds of behaviors that we're trying to prompt.
Great. Well, thank you all for indulging me there. Was there anything that's hard about trying to think of the target behaviors? I know it looks like there's about 100 people here. I know there's not 100 stickies, and there's probably all kinds of reasons why, but did anybody struggle? I'd be interested to hear what is hard about it. And if you're comfortable. Okay. Oh, Roxana?
It wasn't so much the behavior itself. It was just I couldn't narrow it down to one, because what I find really, really hard is the condition. So particularly having to change the behavior without intrinsic motivation. So right post-diagnosis, when it needs to change immediately, whatever it is, it could be the easiest behavior in the world, but people just haven't had the time to accept it, and it needs to happen while you have extrinsic.
Yeah, that's a great segue into some of the next material around barriers, because it's true. Sometimes people they're not interested in the behavior at the time in which an expert or an observer might feel that this is the most advantageous time to do it. And I know that I've personally experienced that as being very frustrating sometimes as a designer who's, my goal is to help people reach their goals, but sometimes their goals don't align with what I think their goals should be, and that's the way it is. All right, so you have your target behavior in mind. Now it's time to conduct the COM-B analysis. And as I mentioned, COM-B is an acronym. So capability, opportunity, motivation. The way that the analysis works at a high level is we use COM-B to understand the capability, opportunity, and motivation factors that affect those target behaviors. Once we do that, we can identify intervention functions. Again, that's just kind of the category of solution that are likely to influence the target behaviors in the desired direction based on that analysis. Once we do that, we can start to layer in the specific design features, the behavior change techniques that fit within the selected intervention functions. And of course, as with I'm going to just say, with all good design, there's testing, iteration, testing. This is not a one and done process. We want to go back and check our analysis at every opportunity. We're constantly getting feedback from people to make sure that we did understand what the barriers were and that the interventions that we're producing to overcome those barriers are actually doing it. So this is also in the mural board, but the COM-B model of behavior change is fairly straightforward. It's that for any given behavior, people can do it when they have the capability, the opportunity, and the motivation. And you can see that capability, motivation, and opportunity are related to each other. They affect each other. So as we go through some examples and some walkthroughs, you'll see sometimes it's not the easiest thing in the world to decide if something is an opportunity factor or a motivation factor, because those two things do influence each other and live in the same universe. And ultimately that is okay, because as you'll see, the model will allow us to net out at the same type of solution for these very related types of barriers. Each of these three breaks down a little more, and I apologize, the color contrast is awful here. I've been moving things over into a new template, and this is a casualty of that. In fact, I'm going to fix it right now because that's going to drive me out of my mind. All right, so capability has two, all of these have two components. The two components of capability are psychological or physical ability. Physical ability is just what it sounds like, somebody physically capable of completing the behavior. Psychological capability can take a number of forms. It could be knowledge or understanding, and that's often the case with complex behaviors in particular. It could also be things like regulation or memory. So one project that I worked on when I was at MadPow, and I have a little bit of information about this coming up, but we worked with a company that was doing safety training for construction workers. And they were trying to understand why construction workers might take risks on the job site despite all of their training and all of their safety equipment. And one of the things that happens on the job site, if you've ever been on a construction site, it's incredibly busy. There's all different crews, the plumbers are working next to the electricians, are working next to the pipe fitters. And so you've got these different groups of people who are trying to physically coordinate their behaviors with each other. And then it's incredibly noisy as well. So if there's any equipment that's backing up, it might be beeping, there's motors, there's tools that are making noise. Kind of making sense of all of that sensory stimulation and still focusing on the task that you individually need to do, that's an example of regulation. And so in that case, that was a psychological capability issue that was interfering with safety, because as people tried to navigate all of that noise and all that sensation, they would sometimes lose sight of, putting on the proper safety gloves. Motivation has two components. Reflective motivation is pretty much the way that we tend to use the term in casual conversation. Is this an important behavior to somebody? Do they value it? Do they want to achieve it? And also a really important thing to remember with this is, where does it fall in their priority order? Because of course, as human beings, we all have multiple things that we want to accomplish. And so somebody might really value a particular behavior, but they value 15 other behaviors more, and there's only 24 hours in a day. So it's not that they don't care, it's that it doesn't quite make the top 10 list. So it's not just looking at what are they valuing, but how much are they valuing it relative to everything else. And then automatic motivation is one that really interests me, because this is very hard to observe. But once you do a project where you pick up on this, I just think it's the most fascinating thing in the world. It's really people's mental models of the value of a behavior. And I sometimes, when I've presented on this, I'll use an image of like fish in a fishbowl, because it's like water to a fish. What is that? Sorry. If that was me, I apologize. I do have a work iPhone tied to my computer, and if it rang downstairs, that could have been me, but it stopped now, so all good. Yeah, automatic motivations, like water to a fish. So our values, our mental models about behaviors, these are formed by our culture. It's formed by the people around us. It's formed by our families and the things that we were raised with. I have seen this most keenly when I've been the researcher in situations where I'm very much an outsider. So I had one project many years ago at Johnson & Johnson where I did research in India. And being a cultural outsider to the group that I was studying allowed me sometimes to see where there might be mental models that were really different from my own, where I think if I had been inside the culture, I would have just perhaps shared those mental models. The construction project was a similar one, because I certainly don't work in construction, very much an outsider to that culture as well. And again, the way that people sometimes talked about their safety and the likelihood of an accident, it was very clear that they had a way of thinking about that was unique to their group and not to me. And then finally, opportunity is about the environment in which a behavior takes place, whether that is the social environment, the other people around you who create the norms, who either support or facilitate a behavior or don't, or it could be the physical environment, the built environment around you. One of the places where I've run into this frequently is anytime I work on a project where physical activity is a behavior that we want to encourage, which is often, because physical activity is good for pretty much anything that people, that ails you. But we would encounter people in our research who live in places with no lighting outside. So if they can't get out during the day to walk, it's not safe. They may not have a sidewalk. They may not have, equipment in their home to exercise. These are all physical opportunity factors. I'll pause there just for a second. I'm going to check the questions or the chat and just see if there's anything. Oh, ethics question. I'm wondering, I love it. Like, I'm very interested in ethics. So I wonder how, if we consider or design for consent in this model that gives the user agency and or autonomy. I think that is a bigger question than I can fully address here, but I will say the way that I'm thinking about this, and I think I probably am not getting exactly what you mean, but in doing research, we want to consent people to their participation in the research. So unless it's a purely observational study, the people that we research their behaviors and what are their barriers are, consenting to being included in that research. In terms of the design process, I mean, as a behavior scientist, I really believe that autonomy is a crucial ingredient to lasting behavior. Behavior change is what I'll say. So I think it's important that we understand what people's goals are and that we try to design in a way that advances their goals. I think as a designer, part of my job is finding the overlap between their goals and my employer's goals or my goals. And sometimes that's a framing issue. That's when we're lucky, when somebody says, I want to live my best life and feel vibrant and healthy and enjoy the things I love to do. Maybe my client is saying that means your A1C needs to be under 7. Those things do overlap, but the way that we frame and talk about them needs to be different so that it's really the person's goal and not the institution's goal. And I mean, if you read my book, you'll see I'm also a proponent of letting someone walk away. If it is not the experience for them, if it's not a goal that they share, I don't think that it is right for us to try to capture them in our audience. I don't think everybody agrees with that, but that's kind of my personal stance with it. So I don't think I did your question justice, but I just appreciate that you said it. So thank you. And then example of reflective versus automatic motivation. Sure. So reflective motivation is something that a person can tell you about. If I asked you, what is your goal? What are the things that are important to you? You would be able to tell me, well, I need to do a good job at my job. I want to be a good spouse to my partner. I want to be a good parent to my kids. Like these things are all part of reflective motivation. And you might even be able to give me that priority order of them. So, if I had to pick one thing to be successful at, it would be parenting. Automatic motivation is very rarely visible to the person who experiences it. And that's because our mental models are not typically something that we spend a lot of time probing or trying to understand. And that's just the nature of being a human being. I hope that doesn't come across as judgmental. I don't understand my own mental models unless I'm in a situation that forces me to think about them and to introspect. Most of the time, and I think I have a little bit about this, the easiest way to see automatic motivation is in the contrast between what a person says and what they do, or how those things, it's not always contrast, but for example, with the construction project, which had a lot of this automatic motivation stuff, we had people who talked about how important safety was to them. They understood that from a reflective motivation perspective, safety was a priority. When they were on the job site and they were trying to get things done, it really often was a focus on one goal that led them to ignore the safety goal. So it wasn't that they didn't care about safety, it's that their mental model of what it meant to be good at their job, like the things they had to get done that day, safety didn't factor into that. We see it overlap a lot as well with social opportunity, because the environment is formed so much by other people. So this is one where people often have difficulty categorizing, myself included. Like if you have someone who's trying to quit smoking and their friends all smoke, well, is it because you're in the physical, or you're in the environment, you're in the room with your friends who have cigarettes, and like seeing your friends smoke is making you want to smoke too? Or is it because you believe that smoking is the thing that you all do? Because it kind of is. All right. So how do you actually research this stuff? The two ways that I find most effective to do it, the two tools in my toolkit that I pull out most often with ComB, are interviews and observations. And as I just previewed a little bit, I like to use them in concert, especially because of their ability to help us understand automatic motivation. But at a high level, every question is anchored on the behavior, so the B in ComB. And if you're looking at multiple behaviors, you're going to ask multiple sets of questions so that you can uncover the barriers for each behavior. Another reason why it's a really good idea to narrow down that list of behaviors early in the project, or else you're asking for a very long research protocol. So the questions at a high level, I like to elicit stories as much as possible and then be a careful listener. So tell me about what it's like for you to do this behavior. What is it like for you to go on a job site every day and pay attention to all of these safety rules? And you can ask people, what, if anything, makes it hard for you? And what, if anything, makes it easier for you? Now, they are not going to give you the answer like, I have a psychological capability barrier. My regulation is really difficult when there's a lot of noise and stimulation in the environment. But if you're listening carefully, you can start to categorize the things they say that way. And then there's more specific probes, that spreadsheet that we put in the chat. And I'll actually ask if Lene or Ryan can throw it in there again, just for anyone who's arrived later, has more detailed versions of these questions. So I put together basically a starter list of questions that you can use in an interview protocol if you want to ask about these things specifically. But you're basically just getting to that next level of detail. So for capability, you know, what makes it physically challenging for you? Is there information you're missing? Is there training you're missing? For opportunity, these are really questions about the environment. So what are the people around you doing? What's the physical environment like? Like, where is this behavior happening? And then for motivation, you know, what is interesting you in the behavior, if anything? What are your goals related to the behavior? This question about what do you believe the consequences of doing the behavior is, that gets at automatic motivation a bit, because another thing that comes up with automatic motivation sometimes is people will say, okay, why would I do that? They don't believe that the behavior will affect the outcome of interest. And actually that is a thing that we're seeing right now with the COVID vaccine, is there are some people whose reluctance to get it is a disbelief that it will lead to a better outcome. And that may be because they don't believe COVID is a serious threat, or it may be because they don't believe in the efficacy of the vaccine itself. But if you read news stories and things like that, you'll often see some version of this. I don't think that this behavior will actually support a goal. So that is something I'd categorize as automatic motivation. So in terms of influencing capability, what do we do here? Like, how do we diagnose it, and what do we do with it? So the sub ingredients, and again, that spreadsheet has a lot more detail than I'm going to walk through today if you are interested in it. And I'll also give a shout out to the group at UCL, University College of London. If you go to behaviorchangewheel.com, or it might be .co.uk, use the Google, behavior has the U, but they've open sourced so many of their materials. So there's a really rich set of resources out there if you want to learn more about this model. For the high level today, when you're thinking about capability, some of the things to think about are knowledge. Do people have the knowledge they need to do something? Do they have the skill? That's a little different than knowledge, right? Skill is sort of like knowledge put into practice. And strength, stamina, and resources as well. So actually the construction project is another great one there, where oftentimes there were tools or, well, tools is the only word, that people could use to enhance their safety. So these are some of the things to think about. And I just thought real quickly, maybe we could pick one behavior from the brainstorms to use on the mural board. And maybe I will just, you know what, I'm going to exert my presenter power and just pick one. And just have people take like a minute or two to brainstorm what some barriers to that behavior might be in the capability area. All right, I'm clicking on get routine regular medical testing, and I'm going to copy it up here. And I'll summon you all to me. All right, so just take a minute and see if you can think of any capability reasons why somebody might not get routine medical testing. Oh, thank you, Rebecca, for putting behavior change wheel in the chat. Oh, sorry. All right. Good, good, good. Yeah, so these are all really realistic barriers. You know, someone who's done a lot of work, and I'm sorry about the background elements moving everywhere. That is the worst part of mural. I think some of these could arguably belong in other categories, but this is a great set of barriers. And part of the exercise of using COM-B oftentimes is negotiating which category do the barriers that we're observing fall into. So as I mentioned, sometimes the categories overlap, and other times, depending on how you think of a barrier, it might fit into one category versus another. So there's no kind of exact right answer most of the time for where something falls. Some of these here, though, that are really clearly capability issues, you know, not knowing how to use the website to schedule the appointment. Yeah, no one available to translate into their language. That would definitely be a psychological capability issue. Yeah, busyness could be, fear could be, these emotional things. So, good. Yeah, I know I can lock the background, but I needed to do it before everyone was in there. I just tried while people were using it and it did not work. All right, I'm going to go back to PowerPoint. So next, opportunity. So some of the things that influence opportunity. So this is where I said a lot of you put things around time and busyness, and I would usually put them into opportunity. But like I said, I think the way that you think about it, that absolutely could also be a capability thing, especially when you think about somebody's perception of how do they fit everything into a day. But for purposes of my slides, I put it here with opportunity. So time, you know, are there ways that you can actually restructure the environment in order to give people more opportunity to engage in the behavior? Resources can be one as well. And it's, again, if you think about the physical environment, you know, do people have the tools that they need in order to accomplish something? Location or physical barriers. I talked about the walking example. That's probably my best example from my own personal experience is, you know, people who just don't have a safe or adequate space to get physical activity. And then interpersonal influences or cultural expectations can be here as well, depending on, and this is, again, it overlaps a little bit with that automatic motivation, but, you know, do you live with, you know, people in your family who really firmly believe that a set of behaviors is not acceptable? Because that is very likely to influence your behavior. It's going to make it more difficult for you to do those behaviors if you want to. So I don't know, brings me back to my teenage days and like my parents not enjoying my hobbies. So let's just quickly jump back into the mural board. And actually, you know what? Hold on a second. I'm going to talk about motivation, and then we can kind of do both at once instead of a bunch of back and forth. So in terms of motivation, how do you influence people's motivation? First of all, plans. So action planning is a really effective behavior change technique when it comes to helping people do a behavior, because when I mentioned before that prioritization of goals, that's a really frequent stumbling block for people across all kinds of behaviors. And helping them develop an action plan, having that time to sit down and really think through, how will I accomplish this as well as accomplish other important things? It's kind of a practical bit of help that often gets people over that hump, so that the things that are on their longer goal list, they can cover more of them. And it also, of course, it can create accountability, it can create self-efficacy, it can solve practical problems, but in general, plans are a really helpful category of thing for motivation. Evaluation. So I mentioned that some of the things that we're going to talk about, they don't just focus on behavior, they focus on people's feelings, and evaluations is one of them. Can you persuade somebody to feel more positively about something? Can you basically sell them on it, make them excited about a particular behavior? If so, you're changing their emotions, but it's a pathway to changing their behavior. Motives. So can you help them to think differently about what their goals might be? Impulses and inhibitions. So this is a place where habits comes in. Sometimes with behaviors, people do, you know, we all have habits. Habits are really hard to break. They're automatic, they're repeated. They're something we typically do very frequently. And so sometimes somebody may intend to do something differently, but that habit takes over. You know, you find yourself with a cigarette in your hand before you realize you did it. I used to travel back to Michigan for work after I had moved to Boston. And the first time I traveled back, I had finished the workday and I was driving back to my hotel. And all of a sudden I was sitting in the driveway of the house I didn't live in anymore. No realization that I'd driven there. I mean, that's the sort of thing that happens where you intend to do one thing, but that habit cycle can be so strong. And then responses. So sometimes we have, not at the habit level, not automatic necessarily, but the pattern library available to us for how to behave may not accommodate the new behavior yet. And so there's an opportunity to help people expand their notion of what an appropriate behavior might look like. So now this prompt is the same as the last, but we have 2 spaces in the mural board for the additional types of barriers. And I'll just switch the share if you wouldn't mind indulging me in the brainstorming one more time. All right, I am going to try to lock this, and if it messes anybody up, I apologize. But I'm doing some work on colonoscopy right now, and no transportation is a huge barrier there because most facilities that do a colonoscopy require you to have a ride, and you're not supposed to take an Uber or anything like that. And the reason why is because you're under anesthesia for the procedure. So you're not able to drive yourself, but there's also a liability issue if they let you get into an Uber with someone you don't know. So it turns into a big issue because basically you have to take the time off work, and then you also have to get someone else to take the time off work who has the ability to drive you. So I'm working on solving that one right now. Afraid of bad news. Yep, the emotional stuff often hits both psychological capability and motivation. Question here, how do you tie your work in with behavioral economics? For example, that new products have to be X times better than existing products just to have user switch over. So I do use behavioral economics in my work. It's not my primary toolkit, but I think it's a really important one. And where I think it's most effective is in the decision architecture, at the point at which a person is making a choice about whether or not to do a behavior. So I also often will use the metaphor with behavioral economics that it's like a martial art. So you're taking advantage of people's cognitive biases. You're trying to structure your choice architecture in such a way that those cognitive biases will carry people to the outcome that you would hope they would come to. So that's how I think about it, basically. I think that over the longer term, when you're asking people to repeatedly engage in a behavior, so again, in the health field, this is something I do a lot, where it's something like, you're going to adopt a new exercise routine. Behavioral economics, I think, can be useful to get someone started with that. But over the long term, people are going to have to make that choice themselves many, many times outside of any choice architecture you can design for them. And so that's where I tend to really reach for more of a motivational toolkit. How can I help people think about their goals and that sort of thing? Because that tends to be something that can carry through even without an explicit choice being presented in front of you. All right. Yeah, doesn't believe the benefit. The reward of the behavior to be changed is too great. They don't feel that getting tested is beneficial. Yep. Limited number of doctors. Yeah, all of this stuff about access is absolutely true. All right. So any reflections on that before we move on? Be interested, like which type of barrier did people find easiest to think about, and which one was hardest? Motivation easier, opportunity hardest. Motivation hardest. Yeah, I wish they just called it environment, opportunities. But then it would be like SEMBI. Yeah, I personally think physical capability is difficult, and I don't know why. And I guess automatic motivation Yeah, cultural mindset related can be very difficult sometimes. Opportunities. So think of opportunity as environment. That's a really useful rule of thumb. So one thing I did want to touch on, I mentioned several times now, I've done this construction project. This is a photo that I took from one of the construction sites where we did research. So this was a hotel that they were building in West Hollywood. And they were at like the 5th or 6th level of the structure at the point where I took this photo. So we're standing on top of the construction, what they were building, but the building eventually ended up being much taller than this. And one of the things that we found with this project, but we find with a lot of projects, there's something called the social desirability bias. People have an understanding of what they are expected to do. And they may not always be right about that. You know, sometimes we think people expect things of us and it turns out they don't. But in general, people come to the table when they're participating in research with some idea of what, what a good person does or what a good construction worker does. And here it was very clear that safety behaviors were the right behaviors. I mean, like we were being brought in by the construction foreman to do a safety research project. It was pretty clear that if somebody came in and they were like, yeah, I don't believe in wearing protective eye gear, and like, no, I never clip in when I'm getting into a lift, that wasn't going to be the right set of answers. And so what we found, especially with our first few interviews, is that when we asked people to tell us about a time when they had not observed a safety rule, they would say, I can't think of one. I am always safe. And we knew that wasn't true because, nobody's perfect. And a lot of the safety things they really are relatively minor. So like one of the ones that happens a lot is there's different sorts of protective eye gear for different tasks, and they cover slightly different parts of the face and neck depending on the risk profile of the activity. But so people would forget to change. They would be wearing one type of eye gear and they'd forget to change the other, but they weren't not wearing eye gear. It's not like they were out there just sort of like flouting safety and, daring to be struck down by lightning, but still they didn't want to admit it. And so what we found, it ended up being really helpful, was we were asking people to tell stories about a time that they had observed someone else not being safe. And so many people, almost everybody, was able to come up with at least one story of someone else that they worked with who was unsafe. And what happened over the course of that conversation is they would see that we were interested. We weren't being judgmental. We didn't think that this person that they were talking about was a horrible person. We wanted to know, well, what do you think was going on for them? What were they thinking? What maybe were they focused on? And for most of the respondents, by the time they got through that story about someone else, they had thought of a story where they were the one who had done the unsafe thing. So it created a safe space for people to understand our intent as researchers a little more. And I think opened the door for that more honest conversation, better quality data. However, the way that we did these interviews, I was with a team member and we were on site at these various construction sites, and we took turns where one of us would moderate the interview and the other one would take notes. And so I was moderating the interview. We were in a literal trailer on the job site where like the managers would hang out. And I'm interviewing this guy and we're sitting around this round table and he's kind of like far away from me and there's all this stuff in the middle of the table. So I can see his face, but not really a lot of what's going on the table. And I ask him all my questions and he's like, I have never been unsafe. Never, never, never. And no matter how many times I tried to get at it, he's like, no, like I am Mr. Safety. So he got up at the end of the interview. We thank him. He leaves. And my coworker looked at me and said, Amy, he only had 4 fingers. Don't know where that happened, but that was one case where I suspect we just weren't successful in getting that respondent to tell us accurate data. Oh yeah, so Reiki here said, I've got a friend who wouldn't wear the proper gear because he'd have to change in the middle of the job and he was in an uncomfortable spot to switch. Those sorts of things are absolutely a lot of what happens. It's not that people don't care about safety, it's that it's just not practical for them or it slows them down. We also heard of people where their safety stuff was literally like a 10-minute walk away from where they were working. And so they would lose 20 minutes at least of their day to go get the other gear, and like it didn't feel worth it. So, people are making calculated trade-offs. Just in terms of some mechanics of conducting the interview, I mentioned that for this project, we had someone else there taking notes. So if you have to do it, and pandemic has changed this a little bit now because everything is virtual. But back when I was doing research in person, I always felt it was best to take notes by hand because it really seems to break the rapport if one person is on a computer typing and one person is not. Now that we're doing things virtually, I've done a number of Zoom interviews and I don't think typing is as disruptive. So now I will take notes on the computer, but you know, I've every time found that the computer is disruptive when the other person's there in person and not using one themselves. Better is if you can have a partner note take. So in an ideal situation, I actually will use like the Zoom webinar setup, or if you have another meeting software that enables you to have an audience who's not visible, with the consent of the participant, I will have a note taker on the line so that I can really be in the conversation. And then best of all is if you can additionally record that, because oftentimes I find the verbatim, especially where we're listening between the lines, we're trying to do that careful, deep listening around the COM-B model. Being able to go back and hear those words firsthand again is really valuable. Just a couple other tips here that are sort of hard one for me. And these are actually some of my notes from the construction project, but annotating your notes. So if you are taking the notes yourself, I will sometimes come up with making notes of recurring themes right in the margins of the notebook. And I'll, especially if I'm recording, I'll put a timestamp so that I can easily go back and locate it in the recording. And then lastly, organizing your findings. So you're gathering all of this really rich data. How do you actually start to organize it? So I find having a grid or a spreadsheet of some sort is useful. I actually can't remember if there is a notes section in the spreadsheet that I shared with you all, but typically I will create a spreadsheet for a project. The full COM-B model is really large. There are often categories that I know that I won't be using, and so I just strike them out of the spreadsheet, but start to populate notes in there. So if I see something that's a physical opportunity issue, put it right in that row. And one of the nice things about organizing your data this way is you can actually start to see just by volume where you have themes, where you may need to focus in your design. So I'm just going to pause here for a second. I see that there's a couple questions and comments. Yeah, building trust and establishing rapport is important for getting valid results. It really is, and that can be such a difficult thing to do, especially if you're doing research on a difficult topic or where the social desirability is high. And then when conducting generative research via the user interview, do you have a strategy when getting them to open up? I find that when I frame my questions per topic, asking the questions engaging their happy, positive mental space works well for the first half, negatives in the second half before moving on to the next topic. Does it support the COM-B model? What are your personal thoughts? I really like what you're suggesting there. I think that establishing rapport is crucial. I'll often start my interviews, if time permits and if the situation permits, with a little bit of chit chat. And it's actually for this purpose, to kind of create a human connection before we get into the topic of the conversation. The storytelling is a big one for me. And I will also, having people tell a story about somebody else if it's a sensitive topic, I've used multiple times on different sorts of topics. It tends to work pretty well. But I recently did a project on behavioral health that was very emotionally difficult. And I found that asking people to tell me stories about times that things went either well or poorly for them tended to work. One of the difficulties is that tell me a story of a time that things went difficult, people will often start to blame right away. It's easier for them to talk about how somebody else wronged them or about how the system is broken. It takes a little bit of time to bring them back around to a little bit more introspection, but the storytelling in general works well. And then Darren's asking about the Zoom feature. It's actually Zoom webinars, so it's an additional subscription, but if your company has it, you set it up as a webinar and you make your respondent a panelist. So you and the panelist will be on the screen together, and anyone else who's in the room is hidden, just like if you were on a webinar, you wouldn't be on the screen. And then WebEx, if you use WebEx, WebEx meetings will allow you to do it. All right, so the last little bit here, from insights to solutions, can you, oh, sorry, can you also use the COM-B model as you conduct surveys? I think you could. I don't do a lot of surveys, and I don't know how Microsoft Teams handles this. I'm a Teams newbie, but in terms of surveys, I think you could do it this way. It would depend on, the topic, but I think you could certainly write a survey that's designed to elicit some of these themes. I just haven't done it a lot myself. All right, so the last piece of the COM-B model, I've used this term intervention functions a bunch. Now you're going to meet it. So it's just the terminology that means the category of intervention, the category of solution. So I'm going to just skip ahead and skip back. Actually, I like this order better. There are 10 of them. And as I mentioned, this came out of a taxonomy. So looking through all of the research on behavior change, basically, if you look at the types of interventions that are out there, they can mostly be categorized in these 10 groups. So we have education, which is what it sounds like, training, persuasion, persuasion is really changing the emotions around something. So it's a communication technique that helps somebody feel more positively or negatively about something. Incentives and coercion are two sides of the same coin, kind of literally, I guess, because incentives are often financial. Restriction is about using rules to reduce the opportunity to engage in unwanted behaviors. So the example on the slide here is about prohibiting sales of antihistamines, but the cigarette taxes in the United States are also a really powerful example of this. And you can actually see dramatic changes in smoking rates in states based on their taxation of cigarettes. Environmental restructuring, so actually changing that physical or social environment. Modeling is when you show someone else how the behavior is done. This was a big one on the construction project, as you might imagine. The supervisors were often not modeling good safety behaviors. And so that was a real opportunity for them to do something differently and start to change different mental models. And then enablement basically is anything that's above and beyond the others. So the examples here, behavioral support for smoking cessation or medication for symptoms, surgery to reduce obesity, assistive devices, like they're kind of above and beyond any of the other categories. And I hate that category because I feel like that's a bad definition, but it's the best definition I have. This to me is like the money of the COM-B model though. So for each of the COM-B components, the capability, the motivation, and the opportunity, I refer to this as a decision tree. You can look at which barrier you are trying to overcome and follow the line in the places where the squares are filled in. This is where the research says that this intervention function is likely to work when you encounter this barrier. So to me, this is, if you think of a design project as having the whole wide universe of things that you could build, this is where you can start to use the evidence base to narrow it down and select the things that are actually most likely to work. So I mentioned before, that categorization difficulty, it can be really frustrating. And I've learned to let go of the frustration because if you look here, I kept saying automatic motivation and social opportunity in particular are two that are really related. Well, also look, they share several intervention functions. So enablement, environmental restructuring, modeling, those intervention functions can be effective for both of those barrier types. And so if I'm working with a barrier and I'm really struggling to categorize it, I usually just put it aside. Yes, the blue squares would essentially have a check in them. Put it aside and I say, all right, I'm just going to look at the intervention functions and I'm going to pick the ones that are common, because that way it doesn't really matter which of the two. I'm addressing it with a known intervention function. So why this works, this actually starts from the right and goes back to the left. We have the behavior, the target behavior. And then there's the mechanism of action. That's actually the process through which the behavior is changed. And then the intervention function, I should say intervention function, I apologize for that, is that potentially active ingredient. What is this intervention trying to do? The very last piece of this is the BCTs, the behavior change taxonomy, behavior change techniques. And I've started presenting them like this. There are 97 of them. It's mind-boggling. It's a really huge list of techniques. And I find that usually with the complete list, people are like, whoa. I tend to use this as a way to spark ideas during brainstorming. So we know that we want to do something now that includes education and that includes modeling. How do we bring that to life? Let's look at the behavior change technique taxonomy, see what types of tools are in the toolkit and which ones make sense if we're trying to overcome these barriers to get to this behavior, given that we're going to do education and modeling. So this is the full list. And there's a fabulous tool that I'm going to recommend that I've been using a lot lately. So this is online, the Theory and Technique tool. And this comes out again of the University College of London group, but they've actually pulled together for given the stuff at the top, the mechanisms of actions. This relates back to the intervention functions. It's like a level deeper. And then they've actually pulled from the literature which behavior change techniques are related to which ones. So this is an interactive tool that's online. And if you're going through that brainstorming process and you want to get even a level more evidence-based, I found this to be a really valuable way to do it. So just to wrap up, and it answers, I hope, Carol's question, which was, can I give an example of how I've actually used this and what the outcomes were? I have two examples that actually do come from my work life of how this would be used. These are very oversimplified, but just to give an example of how it comes to life. So I did work for a financial services company, and they were interested in influencing their advisors' behavior. So the professional financial advisors that they hired to provide advice to customers. The target behaviors they had is they wanted the advisors to have a conversation with their clients about goals at least once a year. So actually sit down and say, what are your goals? Let's review your goals and make sure they're still right. And they wanted them to reach out to that client at least 4 times a year. The barriers that we observed in the research when we asked people about these behaviors was, first of all, a lot of advisors said, I don't need to talk to them that often. I can get them really good results with fewer conversations. Their goals aren't changing that much. I know what I'm doing. I'm a pro. We don't need to have that much contact. That's an automatic motivation barrier. They didn't believe that the target behavior would actually support their goals. They also had a reflective motivation barrier, which has some rooting in reality, which is, if I'm spending less time per client, I can service more clients. So, they're thinking about their own bottom line, their throughput, and that meant that they didn't have a high reflective motivation for these behaviors. So the barrier in general was motivation. Some of the intervention functions that are relevant for both automatic and reflective motivation are training, persuasion, and incentive. In terms of training, we looked at, first of all, a behavioral contract. So this company actually had their advisors go through training and coaching, and basically getting them to explicitly agree. As part of my job here, this is part of what I will do. I will have these conversations with all of my clients. And some of it was restructuring the digital environment. They were using tools to manage their workflow, to manage, they have a customer relationship management system, and it wasn't necessarily encouraging them to do these behaviors. So by actually changing the digital system, we were able to get the behaviors to be more top of mind, provide some reminders, so forth and so on. In terms of persuasion, that's changing the emotions around a behavior. And so we were looking at demonstration of the behavior. And then in terms of incentive, they're already being compensated by the company, obviously, because they're employees, but are there other types of incentives that we could offer? And we thought, well, what about social rewards? So in terms of specific design features, how this all netted out, first of all, can we automate some of this meeting stuff so that it doesn't chip away at your ability to service more clients? Can we take some of the grunt work of scheduling and hosting and recording meetings off of your plate so that you can be in the moment? And can we give you meeting tips that are tailored so that you basically get a set of talking points that are based on what this client is doing? So really trying to make this process easier for people, trying to offer them some training and some support. In terms of demonstrating the behavior, can we put videos of advisors who've put this to practice and been successful out there? So, generate that good feeling by showing you that there are people who put it to use. And then the social reward, can we feature advisor stories on the homepage? They had like an intranet where everybody logged in every day. So those are some of the procedures that we put into place, some of the interventions that we put into place in order to encourage the target behavior. I do not have specific outcomes. I apologize for that. That is sort of the hardship of being a consultant. You're often not engaged all the way through the data collection point. But we were optimistic that these tactics, among others, would be helpful at producing the results that the client was looking for. And then just a quick health example, reducing blood pressure. So the target behaviors here are taking medication according to instructions and reducing the sodium in your diet, both kind of difficult things for people. And some of the barriers, and this comes up a lot with anything related to medication, people who travel frequently or who don't have a regular schedule are very prone to forget. So that this gets back to habit, actually, because if they don't have the same routine every single day, that can really interfere with something that they need to do on a regular basis. And that can be both a psychological capability and a physical opportunity barrier. So it might be both, I have trouble remembering without it being part of a regular routine, but also I'm not putting my pill box in the same place every day where it's a physical reminder. And then another big one is not understanding how to evaluate sodium content, especially at restaurants. That's a really big challenge for people trying to change their diet. You can't read a nutrition label at a fine dining establishment. So just honing in on psychological capability here, again, it's training, education, enablement. In terms of training, thinking about feedback, behavioral experiments, and some of the things that you can do here are really well enabled by an app. So having people train by choosing their meal from a menu game with a coach who's giving them actual feedback on what their choices are and how they could be better, or having an interactive food tracking app, and even an app that maybe can evaluate a meal that's already cooked and pre-combined, which is tricky. Again, demonstrating the behavior. So using a nutritionist, this is something that wouldn't happen in a digital environment, but actually having somebody who sits down with you and says, okay, let's pick a meal together, let's eat it. And I will tell you why you did good or bad. And then prompts and cues are an example of enablement. So setting a smartphone alarm at medication times and having that alarm be not on the local time zone, but on your home time zone, because sometimes that's an issue with medication adherence as well. So those are two examples. And I have redacted that a little bit there, but this did result in movement on the target behaviors. So just to wrap up and hopefully have a little bit of conversation, if you know why somebody does something, it makes it so much easier for you to help them do it differently. And I think that's the real value of this approach, is to really understand the why, so that the conversation can change a little bit and it can start to be, how can I help you? So that is what I've got. My email address is here. I'm happy to have you reach out to me. And I think we have a little bit of time for some questions as well. So thank you all. I'm gonna look back through here. What is the duration that you will recommend from carrying behavior change techniques to observing actual behavior change in a new product? So the time that it takes to see results varies by behavior and by intervention. In my book, I talk about a tool that I use a lot called an outcomes logic map. Here, I'm gonna shut this down so you can, I'm going to stop sharing just so that I can see faces. So the outcomes logic map is something that I do early on in a project, where I actually take those sort of, the big KPIs for the project, and then work backwards from there to understand what are the maybe incremental goals that we'll reach on our way there. What are the behaviors that we're looking for people to change? And then what are the things that we'll notice earlier on in the process? And so those are called leading indicators. And a lot of times I do a lot of work in the digital space, so a lot of my examples are digital. Those leading indicators a lot of times are things like, are people actually using the intervention? Are they creating an account? Are they logging in? Are they interacting with it? Because if they're not interacting with the intervention, we can be pretty confident that the intervention won't work. So we're measuring that early on. And then it really does depend on the behavior and the strength of the intervention, how quickly we'll see results. But I find if you're able to get ahead of that and anticipate the timeline by looking at existing research, then you can be constantly measuring to make sure you're on track. I will say for a lot of the healthcare projects I work on, we're looking at timelines that are upwards of 6 months, because we might be looking at something like a reduction in A1C for somebody who has pre-diabetes or diabetes. That's a blood test that's taken typically, like say 4 times a year, and it usually takes a few months in order for significant changes to show up. So knowing that, we might focus instead in the short term on, is this person making the dietary changes? Are they going for the doctor's appointments? Are they taking their medication every day? With the hope that them engaging in those more day-to-day behaviors will show up. Oh, do I have tips on helping clients who think they actually know why, but you sense their assumptions are not accurate? Oh my gosh, story of my life. Yeah, I do have tips. I don't have like the solution. So I think doing research is really powerful if you are able to. And I have been the person in the situation where the client or my own organization has said, we don't have time for that. We don't have budget for that. So I know that sometimes you are not given the latitude to do that research, but if you can, the research is the most powerful tool. And what I've found is the more I can give somebody a front seat to the research, the more likely they are to hear the people that they're ultimately trying to serve. So one of the things that I've done, I mentioned I like to record my research interviews, and it's not just so I can go back and do the deep listening and take the notes. It's also so that if I don't have a client who is able to be in the room or on the other side of the one-way glass, I can expose them to some of that. So there's one story, we're working for a financial services organization, and it was a digital redesign. It wasn't like, it was a huge project. It wasn't like a life-changing sort of initiative, and we had one person in the client organization who was really stubborn about some of the changes that not even we, like his colleagues, were suggesting be made. We worked really hard on the initial design. I know it's good. Like, you guys are blowing things out of proportion. And we had interviewed somebody about their experience online who was brought to tears by how frustrating it was to try to accomplish a task on this design. And so we took the verbatim of the quote from this person, and in writing, it was pretty benign. It was just like, I was so frustrated, I couldn't get it done. I, decided to quit and come back later. But when you hear the person's voice and they're choking up and they have to pause before they finish getting through a sentence because they were that level of frustrated. We played this as part of our presentation, and I was watching this guy because I knew that he had been one of the detractors, and you could see that was it for him. All of a sudden he was like, oh, okay. So the more you can expose people to like the emotions of the research, the actual, not just the report out, but the process of it, that's my biggest tip. And in general, data, the more you can call on data. So love a lit review. Emily asks, I'm curious how often you go through the whole COM-B process. Is it something you use every time you approach a new behavior or new project, or do I use it more selectively? So it depends on my context. When I was working in the consulting context, it really oftentimes was starting it over for every project, because every project typically was a new behavior, or at very least a new context for it. And that's another thing that I really believe, is that the context of where a behavior takes place matters a lot. So yeah, I was restarting much more frequently. In my role now, where I'm in a product organization, we are looking at not always the same, but similar behaviors, a family of behaviors. And so we do use the COM-B model as well, but I suspect that we won't be going back to first principles with every new project, because there's so much relationship, and because as a product organization, we own a lot of the way that we execute on it, which is different from the consulting world. So as a consultant, yes, I started fresh pretty much every time. As in-house, I think I won't. So insights and tips to share in conducting observations. Actually, we have done, when I was at MadPow, we were doing some remote observations, which was pretty cool. It took some permissioning to figure out, but we were trying to understand how people were using various software systems. And so we were able to do a virtual observation where we had people basically screen share and go through their work while they were screen sharing, kind of think aloud and talk about why they were doing the things they were doing. It worked pretty well, like better than I thought it would. One of my biggest tips for observation is it's the Skinner effect, right? People act differently when they know they're being observed. And so always schedule way more observation time than you actually need, and use a lot of early time just to be there and like get people used to you. So even with the construction sites, like we didn't really do our observations until we'd been there a day or two already, and people had gotten used to us walking around, and they kind of knew that there were these strangers on the construction site. But you give people time to get used to you so that they behave the way they really behave and not in response to your presence there. And then the other thing is I usually prepare a checklist in advance if there's specific behaviors I'm looking for, or categories of behaviors I'm looking for, just so I can kind of quickly check something off and not take my eyes off of what I'm observing for too long. So I guess those would be two things. What other method? Oh, you're welcome. What other methodologies do I like to use? Do I use the affinity map? I have used affinity maps. What other methodologies do I use? Let's see. So I draw from the self-determination theory of motivation a lot in my behavioral design work. I actually structured my book around it. It has some relationship with COM-B. I actually think the two of them can exist within the same project, especially if you were doing a deep dive on the motivational factors as part of your design. But I do use that one a lot. While I was at MadPow, I got really enamored of the design thinking toolkit. One thing that we used a lot there that I plan to pull forward through the rest of my professional life is participatory design, where we actually have people who are part of our research not just answer questions, but create things. And so it's a type of co-design, and it's a really good way to get at people's latent needs. So the things that they haven't spent that time introspecting. I talked a lot about automatic motivation, and I think participatory design is a good way to tap into that as well. For one example, we were doing work for a health plan, and we had everybody, it was around wellness. So we had people create with crafting supplies, like an ideal magic tool that would help with their wellness. And one of the things that we learned is we listened to person after person talk about whatever it was they built. These were all like different, off the wall, not realistic, that really was intended to be a magic object. But about half of them had some element of positive reinforcement in it, and like in the moment positive reinforcement. So I remember one person made a little wearable that was shaped like a cat, and it would purr if she made a good choice about what to eat, or if she got, if she parked further away from the front door. So what we really heard, what we took away from there is that when people are working on wellness goals, they are not getting congratulated for all of the micro decisions they make across the course of a day that contribute to a good outcome. They're getting slapped on the wrist when they make a bad decision, if it gets detected. And they might get a congratulations like when they hit a goal, if they hit the 10,000 steps or whatever, but not for all the little things that add up to that. And so that really influenced our design. I see David mentioned Jen Brazelli. Yeah, she's wonderful and really one of my mentors around this area. I would recommend checking out her. She's got a couple of recorded webinars and I think a couple papers online about participatory design. Carol asks, how is this different from ethnographic studies? And honestly, that is a really good question. I don't know that they are. I think I don't know enough about ethnography to say for sure. And I say that with the trepidation of someone who's taken an ethnography course at university. I think that the professor of ethnography that I studied with would probably have all kinds of reasons why it's different. But to me, it feels pretty much like an ethnographic study, you know, embedding yourself in the context and being a participant observer. So I would feel comfortable calling it a type of ethnography. I found that the crafts workers seem reluctant to admit there was any room for improvement. What was your experience? Yeah, I would agree with that. A lot of times people who participate in research, you know, don't necessarily, like, I've had people who are recruited into a research study and they come in with the idea in mind that they're exemplars, you know, that you're going to learn from me the right way to do this behavior. And in that case where they are research participants, I don't bother to disabuse them of that. It doesn't matter to me if they think they have room to improve or not. My job is to learn from them. And I can actually also learn from their belief that they are already, you know, at the top of whatever category that they're in. It's harder when it's on the client side. And sometimes with client organizations, you will have a team that hires you because they believe that there's need for improvement, but then others in the organization who are also affected by it are not on board with that. A tool that I use to try to help with this that can't, you know, it's not always 100% successful, but early in a project, I do stakeholder interviews where I meet with folks who are not part of that core client team, but are part of the client organization. And it's to learn from them. It truly is to learn from them. But my huge hidden agenda that I openly tell them is it's to make friends with them. It's because I believe that their partnership is needed. I want to understand their concerns. I want to get ahead of their concerns if I can. And those conversations often do go a long way in breaking down some of those barriers. But it is really hard when you encounter somebody who's not open to change because they believe that they're already doing everything the right way. How to evaluate a team working on behavior change or insights, how to know if they're doing a good job. Oh my gosh, that is a really good question. So a couple things that I look for, and I guess I just had to do this because I interviewed for a new job and I wanted to make sure that the team I was joining was doing the type of work that I want to do and that I feel good about. And so, you know, some of what I looked for was how did they talk about the work? Were they talking about the evidence basis for the decisions they made? One of the things that I have seen sometimes in people who say they're doing behavioral design is that they use some of the methods, but then they will decide something because it's convenient or, I don't know, because a stakeholder told them it was really important. And of course, there are always negotiations, right? We're not operating in a vacuum. This isn't an ivory tower or anything. Like, we don't always do the thing that is like the absolute behavioral best, but if the person can't talk about the behavioral evidence base behind the decisions they made one way or another, that to me is a red flag. I also look for them to follow a general process that looks like the behavioral design process. So where you're going out and you're exploring the problem space, you're trying to understand the problem in context, you are starting to solution based on evidence of some sort, whether it's existing literature or research that you're doing. You know, you're going through the design process and you're actually making sure that the behavioral elements are being brought through with fidelity. That's another thing, like actually working through the design process so that these things are coming to life. And I'm usually looking for some sort of testing and iteration, like there should be some kind of measurement of efficacy. Oh my gosh, Richard Hackman, he taught my very first psychology course that I ever took.
That's amazing. I'm so jealous. Sorry.
He was great. And he used to always be barefoot by the end of class and no one ever saw him take off his shoes. He had shoes at the beginning, no shoes at the end. And I don't know how it happened, but I'm a big Hackman fan. Let's see, any questions to ask stakeholders or techniques to ideate behavior change with stakeholders when approaching a new product? So I ask a version of the magic wand question a lot. It actually comes from solution focused therapy, but if you had a magic wand and you could change something that would get you to the outcome you're trying to achieve, what would it be? Oh, puppy. And that tends to work pretty well. I usually put that at the end of the interview once a person has walked through the problem space with me and I hopefully feels a little bit comfortable with me. There's another version of it that's like, if you woke up tomorrow and the world was different, what would be different about it that leads you to this better outcome? We also at MadPow would do a lot of stakeholder workshops. So when we finished doing our research with users, we would do a workshop as sort of a punctuation that transitioned from the research phase into the design phase. It would be an opportunity for us to share what we learned, but also involve the client organization in ideating and being creative. And so like we would do it just like any other workshop where we would walk through a structured set of activities that gradually got people involved in that creation process. And I would really recommend it if it's something that you can swing. It's one of those situations where people walk in the room in the morning and they're not always on board. They're kind of rolling their eyes. And then typically we found that by the end of the day, they were quite engaged and good outcome. So that's my recommendation. Do I find that I have to be deeply aware of my own behavior and know how to change my own behavior before being able to help change another's behavior? Wow, that is an excellent question. Sort of, in certain ways. So one of the things that I've heard said that kind of makes me laugh because I think it's true is research is me search. I think people are often drawn to projects that correspond to their own weaknesses. And I certainly see sometimes in my own research that some of the topics that I'm drawn to, they're ones that I struggle with in my own life. So I don't think that I'm a master of the areas where I work to help others change their behavior. Maybe knowing that is a type of self-awareness that I need to bring to the situation. I do think you needed a lot of self-awareness during the research process. I found that over COVID and now that I've been doing all of my research remotely, a thing that I do that I don't recommend for any other purpose, but I actually keep my own image on the screen because it reminds me to really think about my expressions and to, it just keeps me focused in the conversation in a kind of artificial way, to be honest, but like a very self-aware way where I can be sure that if a person's sharing something sensitive with me, I'm not reacting the way I might react if my best friend said the same thing, because it's important not to do that in that sort of research setting. I think the more that you're talking about sensitive topics, the more you can be very, very self-aware, at least in the moment of doing the research. That is a very important thing to do. How I deal with my own personal bias, that's hard. Some of it is acknowledging it. So trying to be aware of when I encounter my own personal bias. Actually, I can give an easy example that is timely. The vaccination stuff. I'm working on some vaccination projects. I have a very firm point of view about what people should do with respect to vaccination. And as part of my job, I need to respect that others may not share that point of view, and I need to treat them respectfully within the confines of my work. And so it's a lot of constantly reminding myself. It's reminding myself that one of my values as a behavior scientist is autonomy. That really is very central to the way that I think about my work. And I would not feel proud of myself professionally if I were trying to force somebody to do something that they didn't agree they should do. So kind of like it's almost an explicit process of reminding myself, hey, you value this thing. Remember, you value this thing. You're living into this value, even though it feels really gross in the moment to maybe not live into another value. And some of it is, trying to separate my work self from my personal self a little bit. Like I can go vent to my friends after work about it, but when I'm in the moment at work dealing with a professional situation, like I have to keep those professional values front of mind. And I'm sure there are situations where I'm not dealing with my personal bias and I'm not aware of it. So, again, I don't want to claim to be perfect there, but when I am aware of it, I really try to interrogate it and separate it. Huh. All right, I may have exhausted you all.
Are there any last questions before we conclude?
Questions about the recording being available?
Yes, I will put the recording up on all the discussion boards for each meetup group that we advertise this in. And I think it'll be emailed out to automatically.
Awesome. Well, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, this was so amazing, Amy. Thank you so much for being here. This is one of my favorite ones so far. So thank you. Such great information. Great seeing everyone, and I hope to see you all at a live event soon. And yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everyone.